Hey, pole dancer. Welcome to the Evidence-Based Pole Podcast. My name is Rosie Boa. I'm a pole dancer, pole teacher, and personal trainer. And I've started this podcast so that we can learn together, talk with the experts, read the research, and feel better on and off the pole. So if that sounds like something you're interested in doing, let's go. Hey, Rosie here. I just wanted to give you a heads up. This is a fabulous discussion with Eve, but perhaps obviously we're going to be talking about some heavy stuff. So just to let you know, that's going to include a discussion of trauma, how it affects people, psychotherapy. At one point I list off some common triggers. We discuss sexual assault in very general terms. We also discuss sex work and whorephobia. So just so you know, those are going to come up in this episode. And if those aren't good topics for you, I'll see you in the next one. Welcome, listeners, watchers, I guess it's on YouTube too. And Eve, hello. It's so good to have you. I'm really excited to chat with you. So Eve, for those of you who watched the Slinker's Delight showcase that the studio put on a little while ago, you are already familiar with what a fucking stunning, I gotta have to explicit tag this one, that's okay, I'm probably gonna swear again. What a stunning dancer Eve is. She's my pole baby. I'm gonna brag on her till the day I die.
Thanks, Mom.
Beautiful mover. You soon to be pole studio owner. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the reason that I really wanted to talk with you today is you are also a psychotherapist, or former psychotherapist. You're not currently practicing. But do you want to talk a little bit about, your journey, how you got into pole? Obviously, you're really committed to it since you're opening a pole studio currently. And then also just a little bit about your background, your qualifications, what it means to be a psychotherapist. Might not be a term that everyone is familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll start with pole journey, and then I'll dig into a little bit of my professional history. So, I'd been doing a lot of heavy lifting for a long time, and I have always worked hard at finding movement that I just enjoyed, and I really enjoyed lifting. And I think every few years I would try to add something new in that was very different than what I had done before, and have a history of salsa dancing and hip hop and different dance. But I thought, oh, maybe it'd be really fun to try pole. And so, tried a Groupon, tried one studio that was a bit of a rough landing, and then ended up at another. And I think really I found you and lots of wonderful humans, really wonderful community. And I really loved the ability to tap into sensuality and kind of unapologetic self-expression and ownership over sensuality and erotic dance. I know some people really gravitate towards more trick focused movement, but for me, I really hadn't had that opportunity in my life, to have that unapologetic ownership of erotic movement, and I was hooked, so it's been, I think, almost 6 years that I've been doing pole. Yeah, crazy. And I just don't want to stop. I mean, I think it's so beautiful and so fun, and the people that you meet along the way are pretty remarkable. So that's the pole side. And professionally, I practiced as a psychotherapist for about a decade. I knew I had a creative background, but I wanted to get into the industry to help people who I think were having issues with chronically being underserved. So I had my own issues as a teenager, and went through a lot of systems, and felt very called to be a safe person, right? Because just because someone's a provider doesn't mean that they're safe, which is unfortunate, but real. So I really got interested in studying trauma, and I had been working a lot with clients with addiction, which of course overlapped very heavily with trauma, and then really did a deep dive. So I learned EMDR, which is a great trauma therapy, and just spent my career focused on that. I spent 7 years specializing in complex and severe trauma in particular, meaning someone who had really complicated incidents of trauma or many events of trauma. So, kind of building on each other, and spent time as a clinical director at a treatment center for trauma that was really wonderful, and got to create a lot of group work for our clients. And I think it's very misunderstood. I think the way that we talk about it is really kind of convoluted, and there's also kind of commodification of wellness stuff that comes into how we view trauma. So, I was really passionate about it, and ultimately ended up leaving because it's the content, even with great boundaries, is heavy. And but I'm still so passionate about it. I stay up to date on like tons of research about trauma. It fascinates me. I'm a PTSD survivor myself, so it was also like beautiful to understand what was happening and understand fundamentally what I was wanting to change. So that's sort of that background. Yeah, it's a good little nugget.
It is, yeah. And as I'm not going to get into it, and we'll talk a little bit about, reasons why you may not want to do that at the drop of a hat. But as a fellow trauma survivor, it can be very freeing just to understand more. And but with that said, we've said the word trauma like 10 times now. What the heck is trauma?
Yeah.
Question mark.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's interesting because I think our definitions of trauma have changed a lot, even since when I was in practice. So I think when I started practicing as a psychotherapist, which is, like a therapist, there was so much emphasis on like only war vets have trauma, and we really didn't acknowledge that other people could have it. And there wasn't this sense that like the worst thing that you have happen in your life is the worst thing that you have happen until something worse happens, which sounds a little funny, but that means that even things that someone else may perceive as small can be traumatic to you because it's subjective. So if I haven't been to war, but I've been in a car accident, that's traumatic, right? And even if it wasn't a horrific accident. So my definition of trauma really came from that place of like everyone's experience with trauma is different. And we're looking for, did you experience events in your life that are consistently interfering with your ability to participate in life? And if so, we consider that trauma.
Yeah. I think that leads really well into my next question, with is if somebody's listening and they're like, oh, that kind of sounds like me. What are some signs that you should reach out for professional help, and what are some places to do that? What are some resources?
Yeah. I think, a lot of people, like PTSD can express itself differently in every person. And I think that's sometimes where people will fall through the cracks when they want help. But a lot of times when it starts interfering significantly with your life, you might be having flashbacks of the trauma, right? Where little snippets of what you experience come up without your consent. So you could just be trying to wash the dishes and bam, there it is. Maybe you're having recurring nightmares, right? And it's really impacting your sleep, and that's kind of its own vicious cycle. You might find yourself being very hypersensitive to sound, right? We know this like startle response, a loud noise, and you're jumping. Also just kind of, I think something that's not in the DSM, but that is important, is just hypersensitivity in general, like to any kind of input. It can make you feel almost like a raw bundle of nerve endings walking around in the world. And so anything can be kind of like very intensely experienced. If your mood is really up and down, right? Like you're trying to get control of your emotions, but you find yourself riding this roller coaster, acting out in ways that are surprising to you. That's not uncommon. So sometimes people find that they're engaging in high risk behaviors that don't feel true to who they are. And that can look a lot of different ways. Aggression, right? Like sometimes unprocessed anger from trauma can come out in a lot of aggressive outbursts. We see that particularly in men, I think because of socialization. That's a common expression of unresolved trauma. What else? Oftentimes, like other mood issues come up too. It's common for people to struggle with trauma and addiction or misusing substances or depression or anxiety. So if you're noticing other stuff like that, sometimes the root of that is trauma, and it's often misdiagnosed, which is interesting as well. I think sometimes people, particularly people who have been raised in society in a femme body, like You might have been diagnosed with bipolar. Like there's a lot of different things. And so I think it's really important that if you've had events in your life that just are really sticking around and you can't seem to shake it, and it's impacting your relationships and your ability to do your job and your ability to honestly just like be alone with yourself, it's so worth getting help. We want to feel safe being in our own bodies. And if that's not happening, that's important.
So some
great resources.
Yeah, I was going to go to my next question. Where would you look for help?
What do we do? Yeah, I think, there's Psychology Today, which is a good website to help you find therapists in your area. You can narrow down a lot on that website, which I like. So while I'm not super yay about Psychology Today itself, I love the resource for therapists. So you can click trauma, you can click EMDR as a specialty. You can really sort through like, oh, I want someone who knows mindfulness. So I love that as a more filtered resource. There's also great resources for if someone is Black and they want a Black therapist. There's like Black therapy collectives that you can get connected with, because that cultural component and that racial component is really important in recovery. And a lot of nowadays, because of the pandemic, a lot of online resources for telehealth. So it's worth looking into, if there's someone not in your area that's jiving with you, that you can find somebody online somewhere else. And I think just, getting integrated in things that help you, like mindfulness, things like that, grounding techniques, those are really great things to look up and try to practice. But definitely gets better when you have support and someone who's specifically trained in trauma. Like I don't suggest people with trauma seeing therapists that haven't explicitly said they are a trauma trained therapist and can show you what that means. So that's the caveat.
Some great suggestions there. If you are really suffering and it is impacting your day-to-day life and just ability to be a human, you don't got to go through it alone. You can get help, and I encourage you to. And just as so, for those of you who are listening, you're like, oh, it doesn't sound like me. I'm not a person who's experienced trauma. Good. The more people like that there are in the world, the happier I am as a person. But just sort of generally to give folks a feeling of how likely it is they are to encounter somebody in this group, general population incidence, like how common is this? Do we kind of know? Do we have any vague idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to pinpoint numbers, and that's kind of been a consistent issue in the field itself, because there's so many people who have experienced trauma that don't identify as having trauma. I definitely worked with people who I think would not have felt like things that had happened in their life were traumatic, but once they understood what trauma was, it was like, yeah, I've been that. Because being human is complicated, right? So I think almost everyone can expect to have some traumatic incident in their life, whether that's one or many, right? But frequently, you're going to see it. And I think it's hard to kind of get out of this world without something. And knowing about it is beautiful, because I think it can help reduce shame in the sense that we're doing something wrong when we're having a hard time. It is so healthy to have an emotional response to an emotionally impactful event. And if it sticks around, that's just good information. Our brain is changing. So it's, I think it's good to just be prepared for it, even if you feel like you haven't experienced something in your life yet, understanding that this can happen, but you have the tools and that there are resources to support you is great, and I would hate to be overly optimistic and say, you'll make it out unscathed. That just doesn't seem real. And we all collectively lived through the trauma of the pandemic. That was traumatic for every person, I think, globally. If it wasn't, good job. That's something surprising. But it all affects us in different ways. It just all affects us in different ways.
So with that background, you may be, if you're listening, you're like, why are we talking about this on a poll podcast? So something that's very important to me in my teaching, and I've actually done like specialized dance education, trauma-informed pedagogy training, is being trauma-informed, right? So we've talked about lots of people have experienced trauma in many different ways. It's going to show up in different ways for them. I, as a pole instructor, and you as a pole studio owner, want pole class to be a nice place where people can go and have a good time and enjoy themselves, and not have to deal with unexpected, really intense things that they may not be prepared for. And for me, like, it's not, as a pole instructor, I cannot guarantee you will never be triggered in my class, right? Like, maybe popsicle sticks are a trigger for you, and like I use them in my teaching for an exercise, and like I had no idea, you had no idea I do that. Like, I can never promise that I'm going to be completely safe for everybody, and anyone who does is not being responsible in their messaging, and you shouldn't listen to them. Like, they're but with that in mind, what are some ways that, what is trauma informed in your understanding as a psychotherapist? And what are some ways that you might expect to see, space made in a pole class to, make it a nice place for folks? Because at the end of the day, like, I want you to come to pole class because you enjoy it, and you want people to come to pole class because you enjoy it. And when I take pole class, I want to have a good time. I mean, that's why we're doing it. It's a fun thing that we're doing for our enjoyment. So yeah, how does trauma informedness play into that, and what might it look like?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think, you and I have talked about this before. Trauma informed is the new buzzword on the internet, and I see it everywhere. I see it, and it's, I worked with clients who had worked with life coaches who were supposedly trauma informed and ended up re-traumatized. So I know it was surprising how frequently that happened. And I think a lot of it is, just because someone says they have the credential doesn't mean that they were credentialed through a legitimate organization. And I think that it's important to be inquisitive if you're working with someone that says they're trauma informed, to get more information about, what does that mean? Did they do a weekend retreat and now they think they understand the intricacies of PTSD intimately? Because that's also not possible, right? Like, it's a complicated thing. And, I know, even practicing as long as I did, that there are things I don't know about trauma. So it would be, even as an expert in that field, it still would be wrong of me to say I know everything. I don't. And like you said, anyone who says that they do, run. So I think trauma informed, when I look at it, is like, is it contextual to the work that the person is doing? Are they studying trauma, like you said, like in relation to dance and in relation to movement, and what could come up through movement? Because movement can be very therapeutic. It can also stir the pot, and, focusing in on, how do we notice the symptoms of trauma in someone? What do we look for when someone is triggered? Do we have techniques to help them regulate themselves and support the other students in the space? So I would really want to seek support in these spaces from someone who is doing specific learning and not trying to do a generalized trauma training, like really looking at, what am I going to be responsible for in this space? What can I offer? And where are my boundaries? Like, when we're talking about trauma in a pole space, or any space that's not literally trauma treatment, there's a lot of boundaries. So you're not supposed to be an expert in trauma by any means. And it's also not fair to expect someone in that space to be an expert and be able to hold space for your trauma at that level of in depth. So trauma informed, I think, really just investigate. Just like, as a consumer, it's important to be knowledgeable. And so it's totally appropriate to say to someone who's saying that, like, what does that mean for you? Where did you get your training? How much training have you had? And to just better understand that, because it is all over the place. I've seen people who have taken 2-hour freaking workshops and said they were trauma informed. And I'm like, melting on the inside, thinking, oh my gosh, you're going to do so much damage.
Hey, I know trauma exists. What are you talking about?
Trauma happened. Or on the reverse side, kind of what we talked about too, just because you've experienced trauma yourself does not make you qualified to say you're trauma informed, because trauma is expressed in so many different ways in so many different people and bodies. We cannot use that as a qualifier for our ability to support someone, especially because our own stuff might not be resolved. We might be triggered, right? Like, so that's really how I look through the lens of trauma informed, is like, just be careful. It's hip right now, which is terrifying. Hip trauma informed.
Lots of I think TikTok psychologists or psychologists.
Yeah.
For those of you who are just listening, that second one had finger quotes around it.
Yes. Accurate finger quotes.
Yeah. So with that in mind, thinking about, okay, specifically in the pole space, what does that look like? And I can talk about here, like, some things that I think about as a pole instructor. And a big thing for me is I try to avoid things that are super common triggers, right? So a good one there is I don't have music with a sound of gunshots in it, even though, like, there's some great songs that have gunshot sounds in it, but I just don't do it. I do not talk about food in my classes, right? I don't, I'm online, but always ask for consent before you touch someone. Advanced pole teachers, if someone is actively falling and you need to do an emergency spot, I would say that is like the one exception, but like, don't go around touching people. I avoid songs with themes of, a lot of it is like avoiding songs, avoiding like specific exercises, but songs with themes of sexual assault, anything whorephobic, anything about like hurting a sex worker, absolutely not, never. I'm just not gonna play it. I also won't play songs by artists who are like publicly associated with, abuse. Like, it's not like, whether or not the allegations are true, it's something that, like, it was, I don't want to remind students of that in a place that I want to be, again, a safe, happy place where you can have a nice time. So those are a couple things. And I also, those of you who taken classes with me know this, I start every class with a little grounding exercise. You may not realize, but that's what I'm doing. But coming into the space, coming into your body, noticing sensations. I will cue options to close eyes, but I will never ask that somebody close their eyes. Lots of options, right? Like, I don't want ever want a student to feel like, oh, I have to grab my boobs. That's the thing that we're doing in class right now. If that's something that's not going to feel safe for them. So, offering options, demonstrating different options, like offering, positive verbal feedback for people wherever they are in the class, right? Because they're, what I care about, again, is you having a good time, not you doing exactly the thing that I'm doing. I'm just not that type of teacher. I don't want to keep going, but like, those are the sorts of things that I am thinking about when I'm dance teaching. And partially just like, it makes the class experience better for everyone, but also specifically to avoid making things worse for people who are in a place where things have been pretty bad, which I can commiserate with.
Yeah. No, I think those are all incredibly impactful ways to mitigate, a lot of potential triggers, and being able to support people in wherever they are in their journey with that, Yeah. I think all of the things that you listed, I would absolutely say, hell yes, this is so important. And I think a lot about, it's not just the instructor, right? And we've talked about this too, like, part of participating in a pole class as a student in a respectful way of your fellow students is being cognizant that not everyone is in the same place with their trauma journey and their trauma recovery, or even honestly, their trauma acknowledgement. And so being compassionate about how we talk about our own traumas, and that even though we're at this place with it, we can trigger other people. When I ran a dialectical behavioral therapy group for traumatized individuals, we had a lot of boundaries around the way people could talk about their trauma for a few reasons. to make sure that the person talking about their trauma had their experience properly validated and supported, and B, to make sure that anyone in the class who wasn't ready to go there or was, not there for those intentions, like especially in pole, right? Like you said, a lot of people are coming to just have a good time, and that's really important for trauma recovery, is to have moments where our trauma is not right in front of our face, because quite frankly, when you have PTSD, that's how you live. And so if you have an opportunity to have a break, that's beautiful. So as other people in the class, we can understand that someone might not want to hear the details, the intimate details of our experience without consent. And so I talk a lot about the importance of emotional consent, not just physical. And I think you covered the physical really beautifully, to be able to ask people if they have the capacity to hear about things. And this extends beyond the pole studio, right? Like just in general. But I think really being aware that like your trauma is important, your experience is valid, your pole instructor is not the appropriate person to validate your trauma, your fellow pole students are not the appropriate listeners for that, that's not their job, and you could be simultaneously unintentionally deeply triggering another person, including the instructor, right? And I know, like, as I'm building my studio, a lot of what we've talked about, I'm going to do specific trauma trainings around this, but that I think a lot of people feel bad containing trauma discussions as though they are invalidating or shutting the person down. And I think it really is one of the kindest things we can do to someone is say, hey, the story is important. This isn't the place that you're going to get what you need. We can offer some resources after class. And this is the best way that we can support everyone involved, and that it's not meant to be hurtful or rude, right? And while it's important for us to discuss trauma, there are places to do that with professionals and where we can get our needs met, right, properly. So I think that's a really important thing. And I see it happen a lot in pole because understandably, a lot of people come to pole as an act of reclamation after assault. That's a really powerful place to reclaim your sexual identity, your sensuality, find empowerment. But that can be its own triggering process if you don't have the right support in place. And I'm a big advocate of, if you want to find the therapeutic value of movement, beautiful, also be in therapy at the same time. Because like you're talking about some of the things, right? Like you might try something that seems fine in class that deeply triggers you. That could be self-touch. That could be someone else's story. You might, like you said, you might have a trigger that is unknown to you, and it happens. And so it's so important to have the right support for that journey. And the pole class is not that.
No. Yeah.
It's just
someone on Instagram mentioned the physical sensation of a pole sit was triggering them, and it took them a while to figure out that was what was causing that. But yes, I am a pole teacher. I'm a personal trainer. That's what my certifications are. Providing psychotherapy is outside of my scope of practice and will probably always be, and I will refer you elsewhere.
Well, I was going to say too, the pole sit made me think of something too. An interesting trigger for people that I think goes missed often in pole is that having bruises on your body can be very triggering for people. And so warning them that pole can create bruising in a lot of places, and places that might have some familiar memories, it's important to be able to acknowledge that stuff, right? That pole does some stuff to us physically that can mimic things, evidence of things that passed. And I think it is important to kind of be aware of some of those potentials. And it sounds like you have a lot of those. And I was actually thinking of the bruising the other day, and that it's interesting that we don't really say, hey, that might be a weird experience for you to wake up the next day and have a lot of pole kisses, and that how do we navigate that and be forthcoming that like these are things that can happen, and it's not wrong at all, or bad or shameful to be triggered. It's just understanding there are certain places that you'll be able to ground properly and with people, and it's interesting how often that comes up in in pole classes, and people kind of oversharing their trauma stories.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think part of it is, you mentioned, right, people reclaiming their, sensual sovereignty after a history of assault or sexual violence. And of course, pole has such a deep history of connection with sex work, and we know that sex workers are have it rough. Let's put it that way. And I would say that your average pole class, you are much more likely to have somebody in who's had something just deeply shitty happen to them than an average, like, I don't know, taekwondo class. Maybe that's not a great example.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there are like movement places like CrossFit, right? Like, you're probably not going to CrossFit necessarily to reclaim your sexual identity. You might, but I don't know. Your sensual deadlift, fast deadlifts.
I'll go to that CrossFit studio day.
Right now. That's I never wanted to do CrossFit until right now. Yeah, no, I think that that's really true. And, I have my own history of sex work. And I think also just being in pole studio spaces where there is whorephobia can be traumatic, and being able to be aware of like how triggering that can be as someone who has had to do that for whatever reason. In my case, it was street-based, and it was, very difficult. And I've done a lot of beautiful work around it. I own that part of myself now, but I think it's interesting when you're in those spaces and you have someone who is invalidating that. Like, do you have the tools and the things necessary to acknowledge that, like, what they did is wrong, not you, that it's okay to be triggered, that you can regulate yourself. But that is another potential trauma pitfall in pole, is that if you are from that background, as we know, there's a lot of whorephobic pole studios and pole instructors and pole dancers, and that can be really difficult to have that happen.
Makes me so mad. It makes me want to chew glass.
Same.
Yeah, if any of you haven't taken classes with me, I have a studio code of conduct, and part of it is there will be no negative discussion of sex workers, and if you do it, you are banned from the studio for life. Like, if you do not agree to those terms, do not come. Period.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's so important. It's so important. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just...
Yeah. No, that's one of my hard lines as well. And I think also just being comfortable helping create a safe environment for all people involved sometimes does mean asking someone else to leave, and that's a very fair approach to protecting people and being legitimately trauma informed, is understanding that sometimes being a trauma informed space means setting boundaries with people who are also traumatized and asking them to leave if they can't find a way to contain it. Because if one person is creating a lot of intensity and activation in a class regularly, that's its own concerning thing. And it's kind of like we used to tell clients, like, you can't go to the mechanic for bread and then be pissed at the mechanic for not having bread. You know what I mean? And so if you keep coming to a pole class and you're like, where's my bread? And not getting it, and there's been boundaries set, it's okay for there to be consequences when someone is consistently coming in and creating group activation because it's not the right place. And we honestly even did that in therapeutic groups, where it was like, this is not the place for you to continue to share this, because now you are actively traumatizing other people, or you're making them face things before they're ready. And that's also not okay. We get to come to our own trauma realizations on our own at our own time. It's important.
Yeah. So this has been a very lighthearted and fun discussion. No, I think it's I've enjoyed it. It's deeply important, and I think that to be perfectly frank, I think there's a lot of people in the pole space who are actively hurting people. And I will not name names, but after our discussion, perhaps if you look around with that lens, hopefully no one in your immediate pole world springs to mind. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's okay to recognize that it's not you. Like, if you're going to class and you're regularly being triggered by another person, or the environment, or the exercises that are being asked of you, or the instructors are not giving you opportunities to opt out, like, that's such an important part of healing from trauma is finding our own agency and our ability to say no or yes to things. And so if you're feel like you're being forced into a body trace or like you said, like an eye contact exercise or a binding exercise or anything along those lines, then you're not in a trauma-informed space. You should always have a choice about what you're doing with your body. And especially if you're healing from trauma, you need to have a choice of what you're doing with your body. They're not providing it. The choice is for you to leave and not give them your money anymore. You know?
Yeah. And I would say that is true in every movement space. You should always, always, always have the option to say no. Again, you're an adult. This should be a fun activity for you, right? Like I always think the movement in your week, your pole class, your conditioning, it should be a little treat. You should look forward to it. It should be like a little, I get to do this. It shouldn't hurt you.
No. And inside
or out. Yeah.
Inside or out. No, I agree. And it makes it hard for people to find the fun, and fun is also a really essential part of recovery. That was one of the things that I loved helping people rediscover in their trauma recovery road, was the ability to feel joy and a sense of safety and grounding, and just have a blast in their fucking bodies. That's beautiful.
I'm using this as an illustrative example. I am not comparing traumatized people to dogs, but if any of you have ever worked with a rescue dog that like doesn't know how or won't play, and then like a year later, after a lot of work and building trust, they play for the first time.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a wonderful experience. And if you are in a really rough place, you too can have that joy of opening up play again.
Yeah. It gets so dampened and difficult to access when we have trauma, and even just other stuff, right? Depression, anxiety, all these other different things that can come into our way. And I think intentionally cultivating spaces where unapologetic joy is accessible is so important for ourselves, and being able to find movement and pleasure in our bodies without shame is really important. And I think pole can do all of those things, but we do, like we've talked about, proper containment needs to exist, not just on the instructor side, not just on the studio and the curriculum development side, but also our own responsibility and ability to show up for other people around us, right? Like that's also on me to create that space for other people and say, you might want me to just scream at your butt, and I'm ready to, and we don't need to think about anything else,
Yes. All right. Well, we have covered my major bullet points, and I would love to keep talking, but I don't want this episode to be an hour. So, A, where can people find you? And B, we've sort of hinted pole studio owner. We haven't mentioned the name of the studio. Do you have any announcements you'd like to make? Where can people find you online if they want to learn more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. So people are welcome to find me on Instagram. My handle is evita.fortune.d. That's evita.fortune.d. You're welcome to follow me. I keep my account private. It's just a thing. Don't feel bad about requesting to follow me. And I'm opening Savor Studio in Seattle, hopefully in a few months, hopefully sooner. It's in the works. We'll definitely be a very trauma-informed studio. I'm failing if we're not, if it's run by me and that's not happening. So that will be a really fun and wonderful place. And we actually are going to have workshops regularly about coming to pole as an act of reclamation to help students find resources and support. And I'm teaching a workshop in April at the Seattle Erotic Art Festival on the intro to erotic movement that will be fully trauma informed. So if you're in the area and you want to explore erotic movement from that lens, you're welcome to buy tickets and come play with me.
And that'll be in Seattle as well. So West Coast folks, get on that. If you're in California, make a trip of it.
Right? Pop on up. It's nice. I lied. It's March. It's still rainy.
It was 60 and sunny here in Virginia today.
I'm jealous.
No,
I wore sandals in 46-degree weather.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining today, Eve. Look her up on Instagram if you're interested in more. And yeah, if you're a student, know that you can always say no to stuff. And if people are not taking no for an answer, they can take your, hasta la vista as a response.
Absolutely. Agreed. And yeah, it's so wonderful to catch up and go over this and chat with you about all this stuff. It's so important, the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And right back at you. And goodbye, listeners, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much for joining me today, Pole Dancer. This podcast is a production of Slink Through Strength, the inclusive, evidence-based online pole studio. So if you're looking for a place to train, either off-pole conditioning and flexibility, or learning pole tricks and refining your pole movement, you can find us online at slinkthroughstrength.com.